Hey, my friends and subscribers. This is a follow up to part one of our grief series where we talked about the fact sheet and different highlights of what grief is and how it's experienced. This is called the grieving process. Again, I have pulled this information down from a resource called therapistaids.com. And I'll read this to you as well, and I will chime in to add information. The grieving process. Definition: grief, the natural emotional response resulting from a loss, especially the death of a loved one. In light of our discussion, the loved one that we lost, God, Jesus, Holy Ghost. So the death of our loved one, because we believed it, now we don't. Or we're questioning, or whatever the case may be, it's still a grief because whatever it was before exists no more. Okay. Everyone deals with grief differently. People cry, laugh, busy themselves with work, throw up, or even feel numb. Some recover quickly while others take their time. Grief is a natural healing process, and there's no right way to do it. Again, grief is a natural healing process. It's natural. So that means it comes from inside. So if you are experiencing grief, there's nothing wrong with you because it's a natural way that your body processes loss. Now, let's move further. For some people, grief can become too painful. It can grow into something totally different, like depression, anxiety. And if you've been with me any amount of time, you've heard me share this before. Other times, grief might last far too long and take over a person's life for years on end. This is called complicated grief. So if you've been wondering why Aunt Sarah or Uncle John can't seem to move on from the loss of a loved one, or they never were able to recover after they lost that good job. Seemed like they just went on downhill. Some came over them. Complicated grief is what got them. Okay. Normal grief varies greatly between people, cultures, and situations. This is a global thing. All of us have it, but we all experience it different. We all practice different. It's just based on who you are, where you've been, what you've learned, what you've experienced, and also for us, how we were indoctrinated. Okay? Grief is a natural process and does not always require treatment. And hear me good. You don't always need to go to therapy to process grief, but it is advisable to go to a professional to help you if it's lasting you too long or it's become complicated. Okay? About 10% of people develop complicated grief after a loss. So about 10% of people. So if there's a room full of 100 people, 10 of the people in the room have complicated grief. If all 100 have lost, 10% of those people's grief is going to either get too intense or it's going to last too long. Okay? Complicated grief can be treated with psychotherapy. That's where I come in. Licensed clinical professional counselor, therapist, marriage and family therapist, social worker, psychiatrist, psychologist, anybody that is licensed to practice mental health work, diagnostic, and treatment can work with you as a psychotherapist. Now, a psychiatrist is the only one in the group of the therapists that can write a prescription because they're a medical doctor. So you have to know the credentialing and understand that as well. All right, there are various stages of grief as well. Acute grief is typically the one that shows up first. It's the most intense. Immediately after a loss and for months afterwards, it's normal to have intense symptoms of shock, distress, sadness, poor appetite, sleep trouble, and poor concentration. These symptoms will slowly diminish with the passage of time. If for some reason they don't and they spill over, it will turn into complicated grief. And as we talked about before, sometimes The symptoms of acute grief may never seem to go away, may never seem to go away. They can last for years. The loss of a loved one continues to feel unreal and unimaginable. You might constantly yearn for the deceased or experience guilt about the idea of moving on and accepting the loss. This complicated grief, this part here, this section is strongly advised for you to pay attention to as a deconstructing Christian, now an ex-Christian, now a non-believer. All of those words carry triggers too. So you got to know a lot about who you are already. If you've already been diagnosed and you carry a diagnosis, it will play into how you experience your grief as well. All right. This complicated grief can spill over and become integrated grief, or acute grief can skip over complicated and become integrative. Integrative grief is this. After resolving the most intense symptoms of acute or complicated grief, you will enter the lifelong stage of integrated grief. At this point, you have come to accept the reality of the lost, and you've resumed daily life activities. So you've gotten back to your life without God, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost. Yeah. We're going to be talking about this for a minute. So just keep a pen handy. Okay. This doesn't mean that you miss your loved one any less. This doesn't mean that the experience that you had for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and like myself, 40, some even longer, with the God experience. Yeah, we got to deconstruct what was real and what wasn't, but it doesn't mean it wasn't good to you. It doesn't mean that it didn't benefit you in some way. It doesn't mean that you didn't experience what you experienced. I don't want to take that from you, unless it's delusional and leaning over into a diagnosis. I definitely want to take that. But meanwhile, this doesn't mean that you missed your loved ones any less. It doesn't mean what it would mean if it was a deceased person. But because it's a God, it changes things. And we definitely need support to work through that. This doesn't mean that you miss your loved ones any less, or that you don't feel pain at their memory. You've just learned how to cope. So, acute grief may show itself again, especially around holidays, anniversaries, and other reminders. For us that have walked away from Christianity or had something happen, our triggers will come hard and heavy. With a lost loved one, you can still kind of have a bit of control, but when it comes down to this, everywhere you turn and everywhere you look, God, Jesus, Holy Ghost pops up somewhere. You can't even touch your money without "In God We Trust." You can't have a near-death experience without yelling out, "Oh my God, help me, Jesus," something like that. So it's around us. So we may be triggered even more intensely than somebody that had a loss. It's just something to think about. But this is the education I'm bringing you. If you have questions, drop them in the comments. Yeah, that's it. That's the grieving process, y'all. We will be back with more. And as you can see, I'm in the same outfit. I'm going to try to knock down a whole bunch of videos today. Thank you for participating. Thank you for subscribing. This is the Nina Austin. Oh, it's not that. It's Therapy Works with Nina on the Nina Austin channel. And if you are on this app here, you are a subscriber. That's why you're the only one seeing this video. Okay. Thank y'all. Have a great one. Bye.